August 1944, Brittany, France. A German garrison commander writes a desperate cable to his commanding general in Paris. His handwriting is rushed. His ink is smudged. He has lost 3 patrols in 72 hours. Each was wiped out by what his survivors called Geistersoldaten, ghost soldiers. They came at night. They spoke perfect French. They killed silently. They left no bodies behind to identify. The commander's cable ends with a sentence that should not exist in a German military document. He writes, "Send me a panzer division or send me transfer orders. These men are not soldiers. These men are something new." That cable is real. It survives in the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg. The Geistersoldaten the commander was writing about were not French resistance. They were not British SAS. They were something the Germans had never encountered before. They were Jedburghs. This is the story of the unit that became the Green Berets, and the unit that 60 years later would inspire the founding of Delta Force. To understand the Jedburghs, you have to understand the problem they were created to solve. By the spring of 1944, the Allied invasion of France was inevitable. Eisenhower's planners knew it would come within months. They knew it would be the largest amphibious operation in history. They knew it would either succeed or fail in the first 96 hours. The problem was Germany, specifically the German divisions stationed across France. There were approximately 58 German divisions in France in early 1944. If those divisions could move freely, they would crush any Allied beachhead before it could be reinforced. Eisenhower needed a way to slow them down. He needed a way to disrupt their movements, cut their communications, ambush their supply lines, force them to commit resources to internal security instead of beach defense. The French resistance existed. They had been operating since 1940. They had been receiving weapons and training from the British Special Operations Executive for 3 years. By 1944, they numbered approximately 100,000 fighters spread across France in dozens of independent networks. But the resistance had a problem. They were not soldiers. They were patriots, mostly civilians, with limited training and even more limited coordination. Different resistance networks did not communicate with each other. Some were communists, some were Gaullists, some were monarchists, some were Catholic. They argued constantly. They sometimes betrayed each other. They could not be trusted to execute coordinated operations on a strategic timetable. The Jedburghs were created to solve this. The concept was simple. 3-man teams would parachute into France in the days before and after D-Day. Each team would consist of 1 American OSS officer, 1 British SOE officer, and 1 French Free Forces officer. They would link up with local resistance networks. They would provide weapons, training, and most importantly, professional military leadership. They would coordinate resistance operations against German targets according to plans developed by Allied High Command. The teams were named Jedburghs after a town in Scotland where they trained. The first team dropped into France in the early hours of June 6, 1944. The last team came out of France in October. 93 teams operated during that period. They armed and trained approximately 40,000 French resistance fighters. They executed hundreds of sabotage operations. They tied down an estimated 8 German divisions that should have been reinforcing Normandy. The Germans had no idea what was happening. This is the part of the story that nobody tells correctly. The Germans had decades of experience fighting partisan movements. They had operated against Yugoslav partisans. They had operated against Soviet partisans on the Eastern Front. They had developed sophisticated counterinsurgency doctrine. They knew how partisan movements worked. They knew how to disrupt them. But the Jedburghs were not a partisan movement. They were small teams of Allied special operators who appeared in the middle of partisan movements and transformed them. The Germans were not prepared for that. A captured Wehrmacht intelligence officer named Heinrich Müller was interrogated by American forces in late 1944. The interrogation transcript is now in the National Archives. Müller was asked about German understanding of the Jedburgh program. He answered honestly. He said the Germans had not understood it at all. He said they had assumed the increased resistance effectiveness in the summer of 1944 was due to better weapons and supplies. He said it was not until late August, when a German patrol captured a Jedburgh radio operator alive, that they began to understand what was actually happening. By that point, the war in France was effectively over. The Allies had broken out of Normandy. Patton was driving across France. The German Army Group B was in retreat. The Jedburgh program had succeeded beyond what anyone had expected. But the German confusion in those critical summer months had cost them dearly. Reading their internal documents from June through August 1944, you can see the slow, painful realization unfolding. They saw resistance attacks happening with new precision. They saw radio transmissions on frequencies they did not recognize. They saw patterns of operation that did not match anything in their counterinsurgency manuals. And they did not know what they were seeing. A German staff officer named Walter Schwerin von Krosigk wrote a report in July 1944 attempting to explain the changes. He suggested that the British were committing larger SAS units to French operations. He suggested that the Americans were possibly running their own parallel program. He suggested that the French resistance had developed unprecedented coordination capabilities. He was partially correct on all 3 points, but he could not see the full picture. The Jedburgh program was so secret, so compartmentalized, so unlike anything the Germans expected, that they could not name it even when they were experiencing its effects. The men who served in the Jedburghs were not what you would expect. They were not all professional soldiers. Many of them were civilians who had been recruited specifically for this mission. They came from law firms, from academia, from journalism. They were chosen for language skills, for cultural awareness, for psychological resilience under conditions of extreme isolation. One of the American Jedburghs was a young OSS officer named William Colby. Colby was 24 years old in 1944. He was a graduate of Princeton. He had been a member of the Princeton crew team. He spoke fluent French. He had volunteered for OSS as soon as he graduated. He led a Jedburgh team into France in August 1944. He spent 4 months operating with the French resistance. He came home to attend Columbia Law School. Colby would go on to become Director of Central Intelligence in the 1970s. The methods he had used in France in 1944, the principles of small team operations behind enemy lines, the techniques of working with indigenous forces, the protocols for survival in hostile environments, all of it would shape his later career and the career of the Central Intelligence Agency. Another American Jedburgh was a regular Army officer named Aaron Bank. Bank was 32 in 1944. He was already a captain. He had been recruited into the OSS specifically for his unusual background. He had spent years in Europe before the war, working as a hotel manager in France and Spain. He spoke fluent French and German. He understood European culture from the inside. Bank led a Jedburgh team into Vichy, France in August 1944. He spent the rest of the war operating behind enemy lines, first in France and then in Indochina. He came home to Fort Bragg in 1946. He spent the next 6 years arguing with the Army leadership that the United States needed a permanent unit modeled on the Jedburgh program. He argued that future wars would not be conventional. He argued that the United States would need teams of operators who could parachute into hostile countries, link up with indigenous forces, and conduct operations against governments hostile to American interests. In June 1952, Banks' argument finally won. The United States Army Special Forces was officially established. Aaron Bank was its first commanding officer. The 10th Special Forces Group was activated at Fort Bragg. They wore green berets, modeled on the headgear of British commandos. They trained in operations that were essentially modernized versions of what Bank had done in France in 1944. The Green Berets are the direct institutional descendants of the Jedburgh program. The doctrine is the same. The training principles are the same. The selection criteria are the same. Even the team structure, 12 operators specialized across multiple skill sets, evolved from the 3-man Jedburgh model expanded to handle more complex missions. And in 1977, when Charles Beckwith founded Delta Force, he built it as the next evolution of the same lineage. Delta is, in its purest form, a more selective and more specialized version of the Special Forces. The same DNA, the same operational philosophy. The same belief that small teams of highly trained operators can achieve strategic effects that conventional forces cannot. That DNA started in a forest in occupied France in 1944, when 3 men from 3 different countries jumped out of an airplane in the middle of the night and started a fire that would change the way wars were fought for the next 80 years. So what did the Germans actually say about them, in their own words, in their own documents? The most revealing single statement comes from a captured SS intelligence assessment dated September 1944. The assessment was written for SS leadership in Berlin. It was meant to inform strategic planning for the inevitable Allied push into Germany. The author was an SS Standartenführer named Hans Kettlitz. He had been responsible for counterinsurgency operations in central France during the summer of 1944. Kettlitz wrote that the situation in France had been transformed by the appearance of small teams of Allied operators that the Germans had not been able to identify or counter. He wrote that these teams operated with an effectiveness that exceeded anything the Germans had encountered in occupied territories. He wrote that the teams seemed to combine British training with American resources and French local knowledge in a way that made them almost impossible to predict. He wrote, "We should expect to encounter similar units in Germany itself in the coming months. We should prepare our defenses accordingly. We should accept that some of these units will succeed in their objectives regardless of our countermeasures. The new American and British capability for small unit deep penetration operations represents a permanent change in the character of modern warfare." That assessment is dated September 1944. It is written by a senior SS officer. It is being filed for the planning of German strategic defense, and it is, essentially, an admission of defeat. Kettlitz was telling his superiors that the Allies had developed a capability that the Germans could not stop, that this capability would be used against the German homeland in the months to come, and that the only realistic German response was to absorb the damage and try to maintain operational continuity in spite of it. That is what the Germans said about the Jedburghs.